At 9:15 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, 600 meters behind his striking force, watching the ocean and waiting for news. 6 months earlier, his aircraft had devastated Pearl Harbor, and 6 months of sweeping Japanese victories had followed exactly as he had predicted. Now, with 4 heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiyu, bearing down on Midway, the same carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto commanded the most powerful fleet Japan had ever assembled. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines formed a glittering network of warships, and his pilots were the most experienced naval aviators in the world, men who had trained for years and fought across China and the Pacific. On paper, he had every advantage. But Yamamoto also carried a burden no other Japanese admiral shared: he had lived in America. He had walked its streets, studied in its universities, and even played poker with its naval officers. He understood the American character, and that knowledge terrified him. Yamamoto knew what his colleagues refused to accept. The Americans were not soft. They were not weak. They were not the decadent materialists Japanese propaganda had claimed. They were an industrial and human colossus, capable of mobilizing enormous resources in ways Japan could never match. Within 6 hours, Yamamoto's worst fears would be realized, and the most catastrophic naval defeat in Japanese history would unfold. For decades, Japanese military leaders had constructed an image of America that bore almost no resemblance to reality. They believed that a society built on individual rights and democracy could never match the fighting spirit of Japanese warriors trained in the Bushido tradition. American soldiers were mocked as soft, products of comfort and materialism, incapable of enduring the hardships of real combat. In Tokyo, generals and admirals assumed that Americans, confronted with sudden defeat, would lose their will to fight, that one hard blow would force them to sue for peace. Labor strikes, political divisions, and isolationist sentiment reinforced these assumptions. The American military was small, poorly equipped compared to European powers, and the industrial capacity, they believed, could not be converted to war quickly enough to matter. Even American cities were seen as chaotic and immoral, with gangsters and crime reinforcing stereotypes of weakness. Japanese leaders dismissed warnings from the few who knew better, believing their own cultural assumptions were infallible. Yamamoto was one of the few who truly understood the danger. Born on April 4, 1884, in Niigata Prefecture, he came from a samurai family whose fortunes had fallen after the Meiji Restoration. His early years were shaped by the shame of defeat and a desire to restore his family's honor through service. Exceptional intelligence, stubborn determination, and discipline carried him through the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, where he graduated near the top of his class in time to fight in the Battle of Tsushima Strait. The battle was a stunning victory for Japan, but it left Yamamoto personally scarred. A Russian shell knocked him unconscious, severed 2 fingers, and left a lasting wound in his thigh. His injuries became symbols of sacrifice, proof of devotion to his nation. In 1919, Yamamoto was sent to Harvard University to study the American oil industry, crucial to naval power. But his real education came from exploring the United States. He hitchhiked across New England, visited Texas oil fields, walked through steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary, and explored industrial centers in the Midwest. He lived among Americans, spoke with workers, observed the staggering scale of production, and came to a stark realization: America's industrial capacity was unprecedented. Ford Motor Company produced a new car every 93 minutes. Steel mills churned out more metal in a single week than Japan produced in a year. Oil refineries processed more petroleum than Japan could consume in 12 months. This was not mere economic data, it was military destiny. The nation that could produce ships, aircraft, and weapons faster than any enemy would eventually win any protracted conflict. Yamamoto also studied the American people themselves. He discovered they were practical, innovative, and competitive. They argued constantly, criticized their government, but worked tirelessly, showing pride in their accomplishments and resilience in the face of adversity. He learned to read people and human nature through poker, honing his ability to calculate risk, understand bluffing, and anticipate responses. Years later, historians would note that his approach to Pearl Harbor reflected lessons learned at the card table: bold, calculated risks aimed at knocking out the strongest opponent early. Returning to Japan in 1921, Yamamoto carried knowledge that would haunt him. He knew America was not weak. He knew any war would be a gamble Japan could not afford to lose. He opposed Japan's invasion of Manchuria, the war in China, and later the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. He warned repeatedly that Japan had only 6 months to win a war before American industrial might turn the tide. His warnings were ignored. Ultranationalists saw him as a traitor. He received death threats almost daily. By 1938, his promotion to commander of the combined fleet, ostensibly an honor, was also a measure to keep him safe from assassination. But even as a fleet admiral, he remained haunted by what he knew could not be prevented. When Prime Minister Hideki Tojo pushed Japan toward war with the United States and Britain in 1941, Yamamoto was ordered to devise a plan to neutralize American naval power. Bound by duty, he gave Japan the best possible chance of success, even knowing it was a near-impossible gamble. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a tactical triumph: 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, nearly 2,400 Americans killed. But Yamamoto felt no pride. He had expected that America's reaction would unify the nation. His prediction proved correct. Congress declared war almost unanimously, recruits flooded into the military, and factories converted to war production at unprecedented speed. The nation he had studied was now fully mobilized. Over the next 6 months, Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. Islands, colonies, and cities fell under the empire's expansion, and Japanese soldiers believed in their invincibility. Yet Yamamoto knew the clock was running. The decisive moment had to come at Midway, where he planned to destroy the American carriers. His forces moved across vast distances, spreading out in a complex strategy, unaware that American codebreakers had intercepted and decrypted their communications. The Americans knew the attack was coming and where. At Midway, Yamamoto's tactical brilliance collided with intelligence and luck. As his aircraft struck the island, American carriers lay in wait, hidden just beyond the horizon. Torpedo squadrons suffered horrific losses, drawing defenders down and exposing Japanese carriers. In minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. Hiyu was destroyed later that day. Japan lost its core naval power, its experienced pilots, and the first real measure of its vulnerability. Yamamoto received the news with stoic calm, but inside, he felt the anguish of inevitability. The 6 months were over. From that moment, Japan faced a war it could not win, exactly as he had predicted. Yamamoto's story is a testament to foresight and the tragedy of ignored expertise. He had studied America from the inside, understood its industrial might, its people, and its resilience. He had warned, he had planned, he had executed the best possible strategy under impossible conditions. And yet, his knowledge could not change the decisions of those above him. The Japanese leaders who underestimated America's resolve, who believed in cultural superiority and imagined a soft enemy, had condemned their nation to destruction. Yamamoto had understood everything, but he could only watch as Japan stumbled into a war it could not win. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, the Great Pacific stretching before him. 6 months had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor, 6 months during which Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, sweeping across the Pacific, capturing islands and colonies with ease. Yet, despite these victories, Yamamoto carried a heavy burden, a knowledge that his country's triumphs were fleeting, a foreboding certainty that America's industrial might and unbroken spirit would soon turn the tide. For decades, Japan's military leaders had operated under a dangerous illusion. They had constructed an image of America that suited their ideology, believing it to be soft, decadent, and unprepared for the realities of war. They dismissed the warnings of the few who had seen the truth, convinced that one devastating strike would shatter the American will and force negotiations. Yamamoto knew differently. He had walked the streets of New York, studied at Harvard, and conversed with ordinary Americans across the Midwest. He had seen factories that dwarfed anything Japan could produce, oil fields that fueled the lifeblood of industrial civilization, and people who combined independence with resilience in a way that no Japanese propaganda could capture. The Japanese military's perception of America was rooted in a cultural arrogance. They believed a society built on democracy, individual rights, and material comfort could never match the fighting spirit of Japan's warriors, honed through centuries of Bushido tradition. Officers openly mocked American soldiers as products of a soft, pampered society, incapable of enduring the hardships of war. Intelligence reports seemed to confirm their assumptions. Political divisions, labor strikes, and isolationist sentiment suggested a nation that would crumble in the face of a serious threat. But Yamamoto had seen the other side of the story. He had witnessed Americans' energy, their determination, and their ability to mobilize resources on a scale Japan could never hope to match. Theirs was a society of contradiction, individually assertive, yet capable of incredible collective action when the nation was threatened. Yamamoto's own life had prepared him for understanding both nations. Born into a samurai family in Niigata Prefecture in 1884, he grew up steeped in the traditions of honor and sacrifice, and yet his intelligence and curiosity carried him far beyond provincial Japan. He rose through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy, earning recognition for his skill and strategic insight. His education at Harvard, combined with his extensive travels in the United States, allowed him to see the full measure of American industrial capacity. He walked through Detroit's assembly lines, marveling at the speed and precision with which workers produced vehicles and machinery. He observed steel mills and oil refineries that dwarfed Japan's entire annual output. He watched ordinary Americans innovate, compete, and cooperate in ways that would ensure their country could sustain war for years. Yamamoto understood, perhaps better than anyone in the Japanese leadership, that war with America would be a gamble Japan could not afford. Yet, when Japan's leaders resolved to go to war in 1941, Yamamoto's warnings went unheeded. He had opposed the invasion of Manchuria, the full-scale war in China, and the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, knowing that the United States represented a threat Japan could not ignore. He told his superiors that Japan had only 6 months to win a war before American industrial power became decisive. The generals and admirals who never set foot in America believed one strike could force capitulation, but Yamamoto knew the reality: America would not quit, and the nation's factories would turn out planes, ships, and munitions at a speed Japan could never match. Pearl Harbor was his gamble, a bold and audacious strike intended to neutralize American naval power and buy Japan the time it needed. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck with devastating efficiency. Battleships were destroyed, thousands of Americans were killed, and the Pacific Fleet was severely damaged. Yet, Yamamoto felt no triumph. He understood that the attack had galvanized the United States, unifying its citizens in ways that no one in Japan had predicted. Congress declared war almost unanimously. Recruitment stations overflowed with eager young men, and factories shifted from civilian production to weapons at a pace that stunned Japanese planners. The very characteristics Japan had dismissed, industrial might, individual initiative, and resilience, were now turned fully against them. By the spring of 1942, Yamamoto knew time was running out. The 6 months of advantage he had predicted were almost over. If he was to give Japan any chance at success, it had to come at Midway Atoll. The plan was complex, dividing forces across vast distances to lure the Americans into a decisive battle. Yet the Americans had already penetrated Japanese codes, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz the intelligence necessary to position carriers in secret, turning Japan's intended tactical surprise into a strategic trap. When Japanese aircraft struck Midway, initial reports seemed favorable. But American torpedo bombers, despite suffering horrific losses, drew defenders down to low altitude and disrupted Japanese operations at critical moments. Minutes later, dive bombers from the American carriers arrived, exploiting vulnerabilities on Japanese decks crowded with refueling and rearming planes. In rapid succession, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. Later that day, Hiyu joined them, destroyed by relentless American strikes. Japan's core striking power, its most experienced pilots, and its tactical advantage had been obliterated. Yamamoto received the news with calm, but inside he must have felt the bitter weight of inevitability. The 6 months were over, and the war would turn into the long, attritional struggle he had foreseen. The aftermath of Midway proved the truth of Yamamoto's warnings. America's industrial capacity began to assert itself decisively. New carriers and aircraft were commissioned at a pace Japan could not match. Pilots, once inexperienced, became increasingly skilled and numerous, while Japan struggled to replace the losses of its elite aviators. Across the Pacific, battles like Guadalcanal demonstrated the same reality. Japanese troops, accustomed to victories and underestimating their enemy, faced Americans who fought relentlessly, supplied steadily, and refused to yield. Starvation, attrition, and overwhelming firepower turned victories into illusions, and the Japanese military gradually realized the limits of its assumptions. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Yamamoto oversaw defensive operations in the South Pacific. He witnessed the consequences of strategic misjudgment, and he grew visibly older under the strain. He knew what Japan faced and what would follow. In April of 1943, during an inspection tour in the Solomon Islands, his itinerary was intercepted by American codebreakers, setting in motion Operation Vengeance, the mission to eliminate the architect of Pearl Harbor. On April 18, American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville. The ambush was swift. His bomber was hit and crashed into the jungle, killing Yamamoto instantly. The man who had understood the danger America posed better than anyone else, who had predicted victories followed by inevitable defeat, was gone. Yamamoto's death symbolized the bitter truth of Japan's pre-war misperceptions. They had underestimated their enemy, dismissed warnings, and clung to illusions of cultural superiority. The Americans they had mocked were anything but soft. They were industrial, inventive, resilient, and resolute. By the time Japan faced the final campaigns of the war, these qualities were on full display. Island by island, city by city, Japanese forces confronted the combined force of American determination and industrial power. B-29 bombers, aircraft carriers, and tens of thousands of soldiers embodied the nation Yamamoto had understood years before. The war ended in total Japanese defeat, cities in ashes, millions dead, and a nation forced to surrender unconditionally. In the end, Yamamoto's story is a cautionary tale of foresight ignored, of expertise silenced, and of the perils of underestimating an opponent. He had known America, he had studied its power, and he had tried to warn his nation. Japan's preconceptions of weakness and decadence were catastrophically wrong, and the consequences were devastating. The characteristics the Japanese despised, individualism, material abundance, democratic debate, turned out to be the very sources of American strength. Yamamoto saw it clearly, but he could do nothing to change the course of history. The enemy Japan dismissed was precisely the one it could not defeat, and his life and death became a testament to that truth. By the summer of 1942, the shockwaves from Midway had barely faded when the grim reality of Japan's miscalculation began to crystallize across the Pacific. The Japanese had assumed that one stunning blow, one rapid conquest, would crush American resolve. Yet what Yamamoto had long warned, the industrial might and relentless determination of the United States, was now fully manifest. Guadalcanal became the first stark test of this truth. The island was small, dense with jungle, but its airfield represented a strategic jewel. Japanese planners had dismissed it as inconsequential, a minor outpost unworthy of attention. American forces, however, understood that controlling Guadalcanal meant projecting power across the Solomon Islands and preventing Japan from consolidating its perimeter. On August 7, 1942, Marines stormed the beaches. The Japanese, expecting a weak, uncoordinated defense, were met with tenacious resistance. American soldiers fought with a ferocity that shocked Japanese veterans. Night after night, Japanese units launched banzai charges against fortified positions. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery cut them down relentlessly. Yet the Americans refused to yield, their lines holding firm despite casualties and exhaustion. Supplies and reinforcements flowed consistently to the island, a testament to America's logistical genius. The contrast between the two forces could not have been starker. Japanese troops, often malnourished and poorly equipped, faced Americans supplied by an industrial backbone capable of sustaining war across oceans. As the months wore on, the war on Guadalcanal became a brutal grind. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion claimed more Japanese lives than battle itself. Officers who had once laughed at the notion of American weakness now faced the reality that the industrial colossus Yamamoto had predicted was alive, growing, and fully mobilized. Every failed assault reinforced the lessons he had tried to impart: sheer courage, without resources, cannot win a prolonged conflict. Meanwhile, American forces, though often outnumbered, adapted and improved continuously. Each engagement provided experience, each loss spurred innovation. American commanders learned to coordinate infantry, artillery, and air power with precision, exploiting every weakness in Japanese strategy. The war's rhythm was now dictated not by brilliant maneuvers or rapid conquests but by production lines, logistics, and attrition. In shipyards from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the United States produced aircraft, tanks, and ships at a pace Japan could never match. The carriers lost at Midway were replaced with new vessels within months. Pilots trained quickly, guided by lessons learned from combat. By 1943, the numerical and technological advantages of the Americans were becoming overwhelming. Where Japan struggled to maintain supply lines and replace experienced officers, the United States flooded the front with men and materials, demonstrating a capacity for sustained war that defied Japanese preconceptions. The Solomon Islands campaign offered further evidence of this industrial and human advantage. Henderson Field, the airstrip captured by American forces, became a vital hub for aircraft that could strike Japanese supply lines, sinking transport vessels and limiting reinforcements. Japanese commanders relied on risky night operations, using destroyers to ferry limited supplies in what became known as Tokyo Express runs. Even these were perilous, often resulting in losses that further weakened the Japanese position. Soldiers who had been told that Americans were soft now faced disciplined, well-equipped, and determined opponents whose perseverance would not waver, even under harrowing conditions. Every skirmish, every battle, reinforced the misjudgments of Japan's pre-war leadership. Where they had imagined weakness, they found stubborn resistance; where they assumed inefficiency, they confronted unparalleled logistical organization. Yamamoto had predicted this trajectory, understanding that Japan's victories were temporary and that time favored the Americans. The 6 months after Pearl Harbor were, in his view, the limit of Japan's advantage. Beyond that, American industrial capacity would dominate, turning Japan's tactical brilliance into strategic futility. As Guadalcanal dragged into early 1943, the consequences of these miscalculations became impossible to ignore. Japanese losses mounted, morale deteriorated, and the myth of invincibility began to crumble. Soldiers and officers alike came to understand what their leaders had dismissed: the Americans they had expected to collapse were relentless, well-supplied, and capable of absorbing losses unimaginable to Japanese doctrine. The contrast between ideology and reality was stark. Japan had relied on spiritual determination and courage, while America relied on innovation, production, and adaptability, a combination far more formidable than mere bravery. Meanwhile, Yamamoto himself had grown increasingly aware of his own mortality and the fragility of Japan's position. His life had been dedicated to service and strategy, yet even he could not reverse the course of a nation that refused to heed evidence. In the months following Midway, he oversaw defensive operations across the South Pacific, witnessing the gradual erosion of Japanese initiative. Each engagement was a reminder of the disparity in industrial capacity, training, and resources between the two nations. His predictions were unfolding in brutal, irrefutable detail. The Guadalcanal campaign was a microcosm of the broader Pacific War. Japanese forces faced mounting shortages, while the Americans continued to advance, fortified by the very industrial and human strengths Yamamoto had observed decades earlier. The island became the graveyard of Japan's assumptions and a stark symbol of the consequences of underestimating an opponent. By February 1943, Japan evacuated its remaining troops, conceding the island after 6 months of grueling combat, a retreat unthinkable before the war, yet inevitable given the reality Yamamoto had foreseen. From this point forward, the war was defined not by lightning strikes or tactical brilliance but by a grinding, attritional struggle. Island by island, the Americans leveraged production, logistics, and relentless determination to push closer to Japan's home islands. Battles in Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima highlighted the same truths repeatedly. Japanese assumptions about American weakness were disastrously wrong. Where Japan relied on courage and ideology, America relied on preparation, adaptability, and industrial power. Where Japan assumed surrender, America displayed resilience. Yamamoto's insight into American character, an understanding gained from years of observation and immersion, proved tragically prophetic. Ultimately, the Guadalcanal campaign and the subsequent Pacific battles illuminated the central lesson Yamamoto had tried to convey: war is not won by spirit alone. It is won by the capacity to produce, adapt, and endure. The Americans, whom Japan had dismissed as soft and divided, proved to be the opposite: resilient, resourceful, and unstoppable once mobilized. Yamamoto's warnings had been ignored, and Japan would pay the price: one island, one battle, and one campaign at a time. In the jungles, on the beaches, and in the skies over the Pacific, the consequences of misperception were writ large, shaping the trajectory of a conflict that would culminate in Japan's total defeat. By mid-1943, the grim arithmetic of war was becoming undeniable for Japan. Guadalcanal had fallen, but the losses endured there were only a prelude to the broader reality: America was learning faster, producing more, and striking with a consistency Japan could not match. Yamamoto's warnings, ignored, dismissed, and ridiculed before the war, were now painfully evident. Every day, Japanese troops faced the consequences of underestimating an opponent whose industrial and human capacity had no parallel. In the Solomon Islands and beyond, Japanese soldiers began to confront an unassailable truth. American forces, though often outnumbered in individual engagements, were equipped, trained, and supplied at a scale that made attrition a weapon far deadlier than any sword or bayonet. Artillery, aircraft, and naval firepower arrived almost in endless waves. Each Japanese counterattack revealed the gap in logistics, the slow and fragile supply chains, and the inability to replace lost equipment or personnel at a meaningful rate. Soldiers who had once been told of American softness were shocked by the reality. Every encounter with U.S. Marines and soldiers tested them physically and mentally. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion compounded the danger, creating a lethal environment where only adaptability and innovation could preserve life. Meanwhile, the American strategy evolved with a calculated pragmatism. The island-hopping campaigns, designed to bypass heavily fortified positions and capture strategically vital islands, demonstrated the operational flexibility Yamamoto had long admired in the U.S. military. Each captured airfield became a springboard, allowing American forces to project power, interdict Japanese supply lines, and establish staging points for subsequent offensives. The pace of the campaign, though methodical, was relentless. American forces were learning from each engagement, improving coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support, and refining the strategies that would eventually carry them closer to Japan itself. Back in Japan, military planners struggled to reconcile their assumptions with the stark facts emerging from the front lines. The same officers who had dismissed Yamamoto's concerns found themselves facing relentless American pressure with diminishing resources. Experienced pilots, once Japan's pride, were now being replaced by trainees with insufficient flight hours. Japanese factories, already limited in capacity, could not match the American output of aircraft, tanks, ships, and ammunition. Every month, the disparity widened. Yamamoto's foresight, born of years studying American society, industry, and character, had been impeccable, but irrelevant in a system that refused to listen. As 1943 progressed, Japan's defensive perimeter across the Pacific became increasingly fragile. American air raids struck with impunity. Henderson Field, captured and held by the Americans, became a staging point for repeated attacks on Japanese transport and supply lines. Slow-moving ships, essential for resupply, were easy prey for American aircraft, further compounding shortages of food, ammunition, and fuel. The Japanese Tokyo Express destroyer runs, daring though they were, could carry only limited supplies, leaving troops on the front lines malnourished and ill-equipped. It was a slow-motion collapse, a demonstration of the principles Yamamoto had tried to teach: industrial capacity, logistics, and adaptability ultimately determine the outcome of prolonged conflict. The human dimension of this struggle was equally profound. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe in the spiritual superiority of their nation and the weakness of the Americans, now encountered adversaries who refused to surrender or be intimidated. Close-quarters combat, particularly in the dense jungles of the Solomon Islands and the coastal choke points, revealed the Americans' resilience and tactical ingenuity. Night attacks, ambushes, and banzai charges that had once terrified enemies were met with well-coordinated defensive fire, overwhelming numbers, and disciplined countermeasures. Soldiers who had been taught that victory could be achieved through courage alone were learning the harsh reality: determination without resources, innovation, or support is insufficient. The psychological impact of this revelation rippled through Japanese command. Officers who had relied on doctrine and ideology now faced the demoralizing recognition that their strategic assumptions were flawed. Every lost airfield, every destroyed ship, every failed offensive reinforced the limits of Japan's industrial and human capacity. Meanwhile, American forces, guided by experience and supported by unmatched production, continued to press forward. The gap between perception and reality, which Yamamoto had so clearly identified, now determined the outcome of every battle. The war of attrition that unfolded across the Pacific highlighted the contrast between two national approaches. Japan relied on honor, spiritual devotion, and the willingness of individuals to sacrifice themselves for the nation. The United States leveraged pragmatism, adaptability, and the capacity to sustain losses while maintaining relentless pressure. Each American victory, each logistical triumph, each well-timed counterattack demonstrated the validity of Yamamoto's analysis. The industrial might he had observed in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Texas, combined with the ingenuity, initiative, and resilience of ordinary Americans, proved decisive in ways that ideology alone could never achieve. By late 1943, it was evident that Japan's position in the Pacific was deteriorating irreversibly. The initial months of rapid conquest had given way to a grinding struggle that favored the nation with the resources, infrastructure, and adaptability to endure. American forces continued to advance, capturing key islands, securing airfields, and projecting power across the Pacific. Japan's attempts to reverse this momentum were increasingly desperate and increasingly futile. Throughout these campaigns, the shadow of Yamamoto's foresight loomed large. The admiral who had once warned of the dangers of underestimating America, who had understood the combination of industrial might and human determination that defined the United States, had been silenced by fate. Yet his analysis, grounded in observation and experience rather than ideology or wishful thinking, had proven undeniably accurate. Each Japanese setback, each lost island, each failed offensive validated the warnings he had offered, a reminder that the war Japan had chosen was one it could not win. In retrospect, the Guadalcanal campaign and subsequent Pacific battles serve as a testament to the dangers of misperception, overconfidence, and the failure to respect an opponent's strengths. Yamamoto's insights into American character, industry, and determination had been ignored, dismissed, and undervalued, yet they proved prophetic. The United States' ability to mobilize, adapt, and sustain prolonged operations ultimately decided the outcome of the Pacific War. For Japan, the lessons were written in blood, fire, and defeat. Courage and ideology, while admirable, cannot compensate for material inferiority, strategic miscalculation, or the underestimation of an adversary. As American forces continued their advance in 1944 and 1945, the strategic landscape Yamamoto had predicted emerged with brutal clarity. Each island captured, each airfield secured, and each Japanese retreat underscored the consequences of ignoring reality. Industrial capacity, adaptability, and resilience had triumphed over bravado, spiritual devotion, and overconfidence. Yamamoto had understood this decades earlier, yet the nation he served could not heed his warnings. The Pacific War, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, was a relentless illustration of the lessons he had spent a lifetime trying to teach. The true measure of a nation's strength lies not in propaganda, ideology, or courage alone, but in its ability to produce, adapt, and endure in the face of adversity. By 1944, the grinding reality of the Pacific War was unmistakable. Japan, once a rapidly expanding empire, was now on the defensive, forced into a series of desperate battles to hold its territory against an adversary whose industrial and logistical capacity far outstripped its own. The lessons Yamamoto had tried to impart before Pearl Harbor, the dangers of underestimating American industry, determination, and resilience, were being written in blood across the Pacific. American forces advanced relentlessly. In the Central Pacific, the Marianas became the next strategic target. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, islands that Japan had considered marginal outposts, now represented critical airfields from which U.S. forces could project power directly toward the Japanese home islands. The battles were fierce, marked by relentless amphibious assaults, precision artillery, and massive naval gunfire support. Japanese troops, indoctrinated with the belief in their spiritual and martial superiority, faced soldiers who refused to surrender, who adapted rapidly to Japanese tactics, and who were backed by an industrial machine capable of replenishing losses almost instantly. The contrast between Japanese and American logistics was stark. Japanese supply lines, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, were vulnerable to air and naval interdiction. Troops often suffered from malnutrition, illness, and insufficient ammunition. In contrast, the Americans maintained a steady flow of food, fuel, munitions, and reinforcements. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal had been just the beginning. Now, the establishment of forward bases across the captured islands allowed the U.S. to sustain offensive operations without pause. Every Japanese counterattack depleted resources that could not be replaced at the rate they were lost. Air power became the decisive factor. Japan, which had begun the war with the world's most experienced naval aviators, could no longer match American output. As older pilots were lost, replacements were rushed through abbreviated training programs. American pilot training, meanwhile, expanded exponentially, producing aviators who, while less experienced initially, were abundant, well-equipped, and increasingly skilled. By mid-1944, the balance of aerial power had shifted decisively. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps dominated the skies, providing critical support for amphibious operations and crippling Japanese supply lines from above. The battles themselves revealed the full human and technological scale of American power. On Saipan, Japanese soldiers launched fanatical banzai charges, fighting to the last man in the hope of turning the tide. Yet American forces, entrenched in prepared positions and supported by artillery and naval bombardments, repelled wave after wave. The casualties were staggering, and the futility of Japan's strategy became painfully evident. Individual bravery and spiritual conviction could not compensate for the absence of industrial support or strategic depth. The capture of the Marianas provided the Americans with airfields capable of launching B-29 superfortresses directly at the Japanese home islands. Strategic bombing campaigns, previously limited by distance, now became feasible. Factories, cities, and civilian infrastructure were targeted with precision and intensity. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more than 100,000 civilians in a single night, leaving vast sections of the city in ruins. The destructive capacity of American industry, combined with strategic planning, demonstrated the very principle Yamamoto had emphasized decades earlier: industrial strength, not ideology, determines the outcome of protracted conflict. Simultaneously, American forces advanced from the south. Iwo Jima and Okinawa became iconic symbols of Japanese desperation and American persistence. Japanese defenders, fortified and determined, inflicted massive casualties. Yet the Americans continued their advance, learning, adapting, and absorbing losses with a pace Japan could not match. Supply chains, reinforcements, and replacements ensured that every engagement only strengthened American momentum. By contrast, each Japanese loss was irreplaceable, compounding the inevitable collapse of morale and operational capability. The psychological toll on Japanese forces was profound. Soldiers who had been taught that Americans were weak and would break under pressure now faced adversaries who were disciplined, inventive, and unyielding. The kindness shown to prisoners of war, though contrary to Japanese expectations, further challenged the narratives of American decadence and softness. Every battle reinforced the growing awareness that Japan's assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project added a terrifying dimension to American power. In the deserts of New Mexico, American scientists and engineers were assembling the deadliest weapon the world had ever known. The atomic bombs, later dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, epitomized the combination of industrial capacity, technological ingenuity, and national determination that Yamamoto had long foreseen. In a matter of weeks, the U.S. demonstrated a capability that no Japanese strategist could hope to match. The sheer speed and secrecy of the project reflected the adaptability and resourcefulness of a nation that had been underestimated at every turn. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima fell. 3 days later, Nagasaki was devastated. The atomic bombs ended the war with a suddenness that belied the years of grinding combat that had preceded them. Japan, once confident in the invincibility of its military and the weakness of its adversary, now faced unconditional surrender. Emperor Hirohito's announcement on August 15 confirmed the truth that Yamamoto had known: Japan could not defeat the United States in a protracted conflict. The combination of industrial power, logistical mastery, and determined personnel had proven insurmountable. In retrospect, the final campaigns of the Pacific War confirmed Yamamoto's insights in every respect. The characteristics that Japanese leaders had derided, American industrial capacity, individual initiative, and democratic adaptability, had become the decisive factors. Courage, ideology, and spiritual devotion, though honorable, could not overcome the strategic imbalance. Yamamoto's tragedy was that he had predicted these outcomes decades before, yet had no power to alter the decisions of his countrymen. The lessons of the final years of the Pacific War extend beyond historical narrative. They illustrate the consequences of misperception, overconfidence, and ignoring evidence. Yamamoto, with his deep understanding of American society, industry, and character, had been a voice of reason in a system that prioritized ideology over accuracy. His predictions about the limits of Japan's ability to wage a prolonged war were accurate, yet disregarded. History, written in the lives lost and cities destroyed, validated his foresight. By the war's end, the United States had not only defeated Japan militarily but demonstrated the full extent of national mobilization, ingenuity, and resilience. The Pacific campaigns, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa and the atomic bombings, illustrated the catastrophic consequences of underestimating an opponent and overestimating one's own superiority. Yamamoto's story, from Pearl Harbor to his death over Bougainville, remains a testament to the importance of understanding both the strengths and resolve of one's adversaries, and the dangers of allowing ideology and wishful thinking to dictate strategic decisions. The war was over, yet the echoes of the conflict continued to reverberate across the Pacific. Cities lay in ruins, millions of lives had been lost, and Japan faced the profound task of reckoning with the consequences of decisions made by leaders who had consistently misjudged their adversary. Isoroku Yamamoto, who had foreseen the inevitable outcome, was gone, killed a year before the war's end in a daring American ambush over Bougainville. Yet his warnings, ignored for decades, now read like a grim prophecy. Yamamoto had understood America in a way that few Japanese leaders could. He had walked its streets, studied its industries, and conversed with its people. He had witnessed firsthand the relentless energy, ingenuity, and determination that fueled the nation. He had seen that industrial capacity was not just an economic measure, but a strategic weapon capable of deciding the fate of nations in a prolonged conflict. And most importantly, he had seen the spirit of the American people, independent, competitive, resilient, and unwavering when provoked. The Japanese military, however, had chosen to see a different reality. Generals and admirals, many of whom had never set foot in America, clung to a comforting narrative, that Americans were soft, divided, and spiritually inferior. They believed that one decisive blow, one brilliantly executed attack, could break the will of a nation. Pearl Harbor had seemed to confirm their confidence, and the 6 months of rapid Japanese expansion following December 1941 reinforced their belief in spiritual and martial superiority. Yet, as Yamamoto had predicted, this period of dominance was fleeting. Midway had been the turning point. In a single day, for Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hayo, were destroyed, along with most of Japan's elite naval aviators. The losses were irrecoverable. The Americans, with an industrial base Yamamoto had studied in detail, could replace ships, aircraft, and trained personnel at a pace Japan could not match. From that point forward, the war became a slow, grinding attrition that Japan could not sustain. Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa demonstrated the full consequences of underestimating an opponent. Each battle highlighted the mismatch between Japanese expectations and American capability, and each time, Yamamoto's warnings were vindicated. Beyond military hardware and manpower, the Americans' resilience became evident in their culture of innovation and adaptability. Factories that once produced refrigerators and automobiles shifted seamlessly to the production of bombs, aircraft, and ships. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles, yet American logistics ensured that soldiers and Marines had food, ammunition, and reinforcements. By contrast, Japanese troops subsisted on limited supplies, often facing starvation, disease, and overwhelming firepower. The myth of American weakness was shattered repeatedly on battlefields where courage alone could not substitute for industrial power. Yamamoto's death over Bougainville symbolized more than the loss of a military leader. It represented the tragic futility of understanding the enemy without the power to persuade one's own countrymen. He had known the gamble Japan was taking in provoking America, he had calculated the 6-month window for potential Japanese success, and he had foreseen the industrial and human resources that would eventually crush his nation. Yet bound by duty, honor, and the hierarchical culture of the Japanese Navy, he had executed his orders with skill and precision, knowing that the broader strategy was doomed. The end of the war confirmed every lesson Yamamoto had tried to impart. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki illustrated the terrifying culmination of American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and national focus. Cities that had been built from wood and paper were reduced to ash, casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and the Japanese home islands had no hope of continuing the fight. The combination of industrial output, human resource mobilization, and sheer determination had proven overwhelming. In the aftermath, Japan faced a reckoning with perception and reality. Historians and military analysts examined pre-war assumptions, uncovering a consistent pattern of overconfidence, cultural arrogance, and selective blindness. Leaders had projected their ideals onto an opponent they did not understand, dismissing expert assessments in favor of comforting myths. The consequences were catastrophic: millions dead, cities destroyed, and a nation forced into unconditional surrender. Yamamoto's insights, accurate but ignored, highlighted the dangers of ignoring empirical evidence and expert counsel. For America, the war reinforced the value of industrial mobilization, intelligence, and adaptability. Code breaking, rapid pilot training, strategic innovation, and logistical mastery had proven decisive. The United States had not only won through bravery and battlefield performance, but by leveraging its capacity to produce, innovate, and sustain a war effort across vast distances. The characteristics Japanese leaders had derided, individualism, democratic debate, material abundance, became the foundation of victory. Yamamoto's legacy is complex. In Japan, he is remembered as a patriot and a skilled strategist, a man who served his nation with unwavering dedication. In the United States, he is often recalled as the architect of Pearl Harbor, a figure of military genius and audacity. Yet the deeper lesson lies not in personal heroism or villainy, but in his understanding of perception, reality, and the consequences of misjudgment. Yamamoto demonstrated the power of first-hand observation, strategic calculation, and honesty in assessing an adversary. His life, and his death, serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideology, wishful thinking, and cultural stereotyping in the conduct of national policy. As historians reflect on the Pacific War, Yamamoto's story continues to resonate. It underscores the importance of understanding an opponent's capabilities, character, and potential responses. It reminds us that industrial strength, resource management, and adaptability can outweigh initial tactical victories. And it highlights the human cost of decisions made in the absence of clear, accurate perception. Ultimately, the tragedy of Japan's misperception of America is a universal lesson. Nations and leaders, regardless of era, are vulnerable when they underestimate their adversaries or overestimate their own strengths. The war that Yamamoto tried to prevent unfolded exactly as he had predicted, a brief period of success followed by inevitable defeat. His foresight, grounded in observation and analysis, was powerless against the cultural arrogance and ideological rigidity of his contemporaries. Isoroku Yamamoto died at 59, a man who knew the truth but could not change it. Japan, despite its courage, devotion, and ingenuity, paid the ultimate price for misperceiving its enemy. The United States, fueled by industrial might, innovation, and determination, emerged victorious. The story of the Pacific War, seen through the lens of Yamamoto's warnings, offers enduring lessons about intelligence, strategy, and the perils of underestimating the world beyond one's own borders. In the end, the Japanese leadership had built an image of America that did not exist, a fantasy of weakness and division. The real America, the one Yamamoto had experienced and understood, was formidable, resilient, and relentless. And it was this reality, not ideology or myth, that shaped the outcome of World War II. By late 1943, the Pacific War had shifted decisively against Japan, yet the empire refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster unfolding around it. The Japanese High Command, still clinging to their illusions of superiority, had begun to feel the sting of reality in every theater. Guadalcanal had already taught the first brutal lessons about American tenacity and industrial power. Now, the fighting in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific revealed that Yamamoto's warnings had been tragically prescient. Even without the admiral, his predictions were playing out with relentless precision. American forces, equipped with new aircraft carriers, faster destroyers, and increasingly skilled pilots, were systematically dismantling Japan's forward positions. On every island, Japanese soldiers encountered an enemy that refused to bend under pressure. At Bougainville, Saipan, and Tarawa, Marines assaulted fortified positions with determination and coordination that stunned Japanese defenders. Each assault highlighted a terrifying truth: the Americans did not fight as individuals alone, but as parts of a larger machine, an industrialized and strategically coordinated force that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. In Tokyo, the reports filtering back from the front lines began to sow seeds of doubt among the senior staff. Field commanders described the Americans as disciplined, innovative, and relentlessly aggressive. Messages from surviving aviators spoke of Americans launching waves of attacks, constantly adapting tactics, and exploiting every weakness in Japanese defensive positions. But despite the mounting evidence, the same cultural arrogance and denial that had led Japan to Pearl Harbor persisted. Leadership preferred to dismiss these accounts as isolated incidents, failing to grasp the full strategic implications. Meanwhile, American logistical superiority became increasingly evident. At every landing, Marines and soldiers arrived with steady supplies of food, ammunition, and medical care. Medical units treated wounded with efficiency, ensuring troops returned to the front. Engineers repaired airfields, built roads, and extended supply lines while Japanese units struggled to maintain meager stockpiles under constant bombardment. On the battlefield, this disparity manifested as steadily increasing Japanese casualties. Soldiers weakened by malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion were forced to confront an enemy that seemed to multiply rather than diminish with each engagement. The contrast between Japanese assumptions and the reality of American military power became painfully clear at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese pilots, still hoping to regain some control over the Pacific skies, faced squadrons of American aviators whose skill, numbers, and aircraft quality had dramatically improved since the war's early months. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of experienced Japanese pilots were shot down in a single day, leaving the empire unable to replace their losses. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to train and deploy new pilots faster than Japan could even count the dead. At the same time, Japan's industrial limitations became an undeniable weakness. Factories struggled to produce enough aircraft, ammunition, and ships. Fuel shortages became chronic, restricting training flights and operational readiness. In contrast, the United States, fully mobilized and leveraging the techniques Yamamoto had observed decades earlier, churned out thousands of aircraft, ships, and tanks. Every new vessel launched from American shipyards, every new bomber rolling off the assembly line, widened the gap between the two nations. The war, once perceived as a series of tactical engagements, was now a test of industrial endurance, and Japan was failing. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe in the spiritual superiority of their nation, now confronted the reality that courage and loyalty alone could not secure victory. At each island, they faced an enemy willing to absorb casualties, innovate tactics, and exploit logistical advantages. The relentless pace of American operations shattered any illusions of a short, decisive war. The lessons of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands coalesced into a stark truth: Japan could not sustain a prolonged conflict against a nation with the industrial depth, strategic flexibility, and collective resolve of the United States. Yet even as the war turned into a grinding struggle of attrition, the Japanese leadership clung to ideology over reality. Senior commanders still imagined that individual valor and devotion to the emperor could compensate for deficits in numbers, equipment, and supplies. Soldiers were ordered to execute banzai charges against entrenched positions, often with devastating losses. Morale remained high in theory, fueled by propaganda and the cult of honor, but in practice, exhaustion and despair eroded combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, the Americans pressed forward, exploiting weaknesses with precision, ensuring that each Japanese counterattack exacted a heavier toll. American innovation, both technological and strategic, now dominated the conflict. Amphibious assaults were coordinated with air and naval bombardment in a way that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. Aircraft carriers allowed rapid redeployment of air power, ensuring that every counteroffensive was met with immediate, overwhelming force. Intelligence operations, including signals interception and code-breaking, provided real-time information that Japanese commanders could not anticipate. The combination of strategy, technology, and industrial output created a force that Japan, even at the height of its empire, could not match. By late 1944, the war had reached the Philippines, the Marianas, and the approaches to the Japanese home islands. The Japanese High Command, forced to confront the undeniable reality of defeat, began to prepare for a conflict that would no longer be decided by bravery alone. Cities and industrial centers became targets as American air power and logistics brought destruction to the homeland. The firebombing campaigns, followed by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of American mobilization. Japan's population, exhausted and terrified, finally faced the consequences of underestimating an opponent who had been fully understood by Yamamoto decades earlier. The tragedy of Japan's misperception was complete. Leaders had dismissed warnings, assumed cultural and spiritual superiority, and believed that one decisive blow could end the war. In reality, the war required not just courage, but industrial capacity, logistical mastery, and strategic adaptability. Every aspect of American society, its industry, its innovation, its willingness to mobilize, had been underestimated. Every lesson Yamamoto had attempted to convey, from Midway to Guadalcanal, had been proven correct in the most painful manner. Even after surrender, Japanese reflection focused on the systemic failures that had led to catastrophe. Analysts and historians noted the dangers of ideology, wishful thinking, and cultural stereotyping. The empire's collapse underscored a universal lesson, that understanding the enemy, assessing capabilities honestly, and respecting evidence over assumption are essential to strategic success. Yamamoto's life and death, emblematic of foresight ignored, became a lasting testament to the peril of ignoring reality for comfort, pride, or ideology. In the end, the Americans had not simply won through force of arms, they had won because they embodied the very strengths that Japan had dismissed. Industrial output, innovation, adaptability, and resilience had turned every assumed weakness into advantage. Japanese forces, despite extraordinary courage and devotion, were systematically overwhelmed by an opponent they had misunderstood from the start. The narrative of a soft, divided, and spiritually weak America had been shattered, replaced by a reality far more formidable than Japanese leaders could ever have imagined. By early 1944, the Pacific conflict had become a relentless, grinding struggle of attrition that revealed the true depth of American industrial and strategic power. Japan's initial victories had created a deceptive illusion of invincibility, but the reality on the battlefield now painted a starkly different picture. The Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Marianas had become proving grounds where the empire's limitations collided with the overwhelming resources and determination of the United States. Every island, every airfield, every coastline highlighted a truth that Japanese leadership had long refused to accept: the Americans were not soft, they were not divided, and they would not yield. The American advance was methodical and unyielding. At Saipan and Tinian, Marines and Army units struck Japanese positions with coordination that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. Pre-invasion bombardments, naval gunfire, and airstrikes softened defenses before ground troops ever set foot on the beaches. Japanese soldiers, trained in the Bushido Code and devoted to the emperor, met these waves with courage and determination, but it was increasingly clear that bravery alone could not compensate for shortages in ammunition, equipment, and reinforcements. As defenders fell, replacements arrived with terrifying speed, reinforcing the notion that the Americans could absorb losses that would have crippled Japan. Every logistical advantage reinforced American superiority. While Japanese supply lines faltered under the relentless pressure of air raids and submarine attacks, American convoys arrived steadily, delivering food, medical supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements. Engineers repaired and expanded captured airfields within days, enabling continuous air support that pinned Japanese troops in place. The contrast between the well-fed, well-equipped, and well-supported Americans and the starving, exhausted, and poorly supplied Japanese defenders was dramatic, a visible manifestation of the industrial gap that Yamamoto had predicted. The naval battles of 1944 further demonstrated the widening disparity. At the Philippine Sea, Japanese aircraft carriers faced a new generation of American aviators, equipped with faster planes, superior radar guidance, and larger formations. Veteran Japanese pilots were decimated, replaced by less experienced aviators who could not match the Americans' coordination or tactical flexibility. The so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot became emblematic of Japan's inability to sustain a war against a fully mobilized industrial power. In a single day, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed while American losses were minimal. It was a turning point that confirmed what Yamamoto had foreseen: Japan could not replace its losses fast enough to compete with American production and training capabilities. On the ground, Japanese soldiers continued to fight with the utmost bravery, but the war had become a series of desperate defensive actions. At Poliliu and Iwo Jima, fortified positions and tunnels could not compensate for the sheer scale of American firepower. Marines assaulted cliffs and bunkers with relentless determination, supported by artillery, naval bombardments, and continuous aerial strikes. Japanese commanders, once confident that spiritual superiority and individual heroism could tip the balance, were confronted with a reality in which industrial and logistical might dictated outcomes. Every attack against entrenched positions cost Japanese lives at unsustainable rates, while American forces maintained the offensive with minimal interruption. The psychological impact of American resilience was equally profound. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated to believe that their opponents would crumble under pressure, yet the Americans refused to yield. Reports from the front lines described troops who, despite heavy casualties, continued to advance, improvise, and adapt. Even when supply lines were stretched or disrupted, American soldiers demonstrated an ingenuity and tenacity that defied Japanese expectations. This unrelenting drive, combined with overwhelming material support, gradually eroded the myth of Japanese invincibility. By mid-1944, Japan's strategic situation was dire. The Marianas Campaign had placed American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, and the industrial capacity of the United States meant that replacements, reinforcements, and new technology arrived faster than Japan could destroy them. Firepower, aircraft, ships, and soldiers flowed from American factories in quantities Japan could not hope to match. Yamamoto's warnings about industrial disparity were now painfully evident. Courage, discipline, and devotion were meaningless when an opponent could outproduce and outmaneuver at every turn. In addition to logistics and industrial might, American strategy emphasized flexibility and innovation. Commanders like Nimitz and MacArthur orchestrated amphibious assaults, coordinated multi-branch operations, and leveraged intelligence breakthroughs to anticipate Japanese movements. Signals intelligence, code breaking, and aerial reconnaissance allowed American forces to strike decisively while minimizing risk. Japan's rigid command structure and over-reliance on doctrine prevented effective adaptation, leaving forces exposed to predictable patterns of attack. The combination of superior planning, intelligence, and execution made the American advance both efficient and devastating. Throughout the Pacific, the human dimension of the war further illustrated the American advantage. Soldiers and Marines displayed resilience under fire, engineers rapidly repaired airfields, and medical units ensured the survival of wounded troops. Japanese prisoners of war, often indoctrinated to expect brutality, were surprised by humane treatment, adequate food, and medical care. This reinforced the perception that Americans possessed not only industrial and military power but also an organizational and cultural adaptability that Japan could not replicate. The societal strengths Yamamoto had observed decades earlier, practicality, innovation, and determination, were now fully mobilized and directly shaping the course of the war. By late 1944 and early 1945, the outcome of the Pacific conflict was increasingly inevitable. Battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated that Japanese forces could still inflict heavy casualties, yet they could not stop the overall advance. Every island taken, every airfield captured, and every strategic position secured reinforced the truth Yamamoto had long tried to communicate: Japan had misjudged its enemy, and that misjudgment carried catastrophic consequences. The combination of industrial output, strategic innovation, and relentless determination created a force that Japan could not match, no matter how skillfully its soldiers fought or how bravely its commanders led. As American bombers began to strike the Japanese mainland, the cumulative effects of the Pacific campaigns became apparent. Cities burned, civilians suffered, and the empire faced devastation on a scale previously unimaginable. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the ultimate demonstration of the industrial and technological might that Yamamoto had understood decades before. They symbolized not only scientific achievement but the capacity of a fully mobilized society to convert resources, knowledge, and labor into decisive military power. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, was not the result of a single defeat but the cumulative weight of strategic misperception, industrial inferiority, and underestimation of an enemy whose strengths had been understood all along by one man, Isoroku Yamamoto. In the aftermath, historians and analysts reflected on the lessons of the Pacific War. They recognized the dangers of ideological arrogance, cultural stereotyping, and ignoring expert advice. Yamamoto's life and death stood as a testament to the importance of understanding reality over comforting myths. The Americans, whom Japan had dismissed as soft and incapable of sustained conflict, had demonstrated a combination of industrial power, strategic flexibility, and human resilience that secured victory. The very qualities Japan had derided, individual initiative, material abundance, and democratic coordination, proved to be decisive instruments of war. By mid-1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its devastating climax. American forces had swept through island after island, each victory bringing them ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The lessons Yamamoto had tried to impart were now brutally evident. Japanese soldiers, no matter how brave or disciplined, could not overcome the overwhelming industrial, logistical, and strategic power of the United States. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated the lengths to which Japanese forces would go to defend their homeland, yet they also revealed the futility of resistance in the face of a fully mobilized opponent. On Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders had constructed an elaborate network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions. Soldiers dug deep into volcanic rock, preparing to fight to the last man. For weeks, American Marines advanced under withering fire, facing sniper positions, machine guns, and artillery at every turn. The Japanese fought with incredible determination, employing banzai charges and defensive ingenuity that inflicted severe casualties on the attackers. Yet, no matter how fierce the defense, each American advance was met with reinforcements, resupply, and continuous bombardment. What Yamamoto had foreseen, the inability of Japan to replace losses and sustain prolonged engagements, was now painfully clear. The battle for Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, further illustrated the chasm between Japanese expectations and American capabilities. Okinawa was critical. Its capture would provide the Allies with a staging area for a potential invasion of the Japanese mainland. Japanese soldiers, entrenched in mountains and caves, launched determined counterattacks. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and the island became a crucible of suffering and death. Yet, American forces, equipped with superior artillery, armor, and air support, maintained relentless pressure. Supply chains remained unbroken, casualty replacements flowed in, and medical care saved countless lives that Japanese defenders could not hope to match. Japan's earlier assumptions that one decisive blow could demoralize the Americans had proven catastrophic. Now, the Americans absorbed staggering losses and continued to press forward. As American forces closed in, air superiority became a decisive factor. The skies above Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and the surrounding waters were dominated by the latest American aircraft. Pilots, trained rapidly but effectively, executed precision bombing and close air support that Japanese anti-aircraft defenses could not counter. Kamikaze attacks inflicted damage and terror, but the Americans adapted, developing strategies to neutralize these desperate measures. Yamamoto had understood decades earlier that industrial capacity would shape the war, and now the reality was unmistakable. America could replace planes, pilots, and ships faster than Japan could destroy them. The tactical bravery of Japanese forces was insufficient against the overwhelming momentum of industrialized warfare. On the home islands, the consequences of this attritional struggle became increasingly severe. American bombers, initially conducting precision raids, had shifted to firebombing campaigns against urban centers. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other cities burned as incendiary bombs consumed wooden structures. Civilian populations suffered horrific losses, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to ashes in single nights of relentless bombing. The B-29 superfortress, a marvel of engineering and a testament to American industrial might, carried out missions that Japanese leaders had considered impossible before the war. Factories, transport networks, and civilian infrastructure were targeted systematically, weakening Japan's ability to resist both militarily and psychologically. Yamamoto's foresight about the decisive role of industrial capacity was evident in every strike, every destroyed aircraft, and every collapsed supply chain. While Japanese soldiers and commanders fought with devotion and ingenuity, they were increasingly powerless against an enemy whose economic and technological resources dwarfed their own. Factories that once produced consumer goods had been converted into engines of war production in the United States. Aircraft, tanks, ships, and munitions flowed steadily to the Pacific, where American forces deployed them in overwhelming numbers. The contrast between Japanese resource scarcity and American abundance could not have been starker. The psychological impact on Japanese forces and civilians was profound. The myth of American softness, once propagated through propaganda and cultural assumptions, had been shattered. Soldiers realized that their opponents would not surrender, would not break under pressure, and would fight relentlessly despite heavy casualties. Civilians, enduring air raids, food shortages, and mass evacuations, recognized the grim reality of their nation's strategic predicament. The very qualities that Yamamoto had observed in American society, resilience, innovation, and determination, were now manifest on the battlefield and in the factories, turning abstract predictions into deadly realities. In August 1945, the culmination of these factors brought the war to an unprecedented and devastating conclusion. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9 were the ultimate demonstration of American industrial, scientific, and logistical power. These weapons were not merely technological marvels, they were the concentrated result of an entire nation's capacity to mobilize, innovate, and execute on a massive scale. Cities that had once seemed untouchable were obliterated in moments, highlighting the scale of destruction that Japan could neither anticipate nor counter. The Emperor's announcement of surrender on August 15 marked the end of a conflict that had begun with hubris, overconfidence, and a profound underestimation of the American enemy. The lessons of the war, seen through Yamamoto's foresight, were unmistakable. Japanese leadership had misread the nature of America, dismissing industrial capacity, democratic resilience, and cultural adaptability as weaknesses rather than sources of extraordinary strength. The consequences of that misperception were catastrophic, resulting in millions of deaths, widespread destruction, and the collapse of an empire. Yamamoto, who had understood America better than any of his contemporaries, had spent years trying to warn his nation. Despite his knowledge, skill, and strategic insight, he could not prevent the disaster that followed, a tragedy rooted not in the capabilities of the enemy, but in the failures of perception, arrogance, and ideological rigidity within Japan itself. Even after the surrender, reflections on Yamamoto's life and predictions illuminated the enduring truths of his assessments. The characteristics that Japanese leaders had mocked, the individualism, material abundance, and democratic organization of American society, had been decisive factors in securing victory. The ability to innovate rapidly, to absorb losses, and to sustain operations over vast distances had turned apparent weaknesses into strategic strengths. Yamamoto's warnings, unheeded at the time, became a case study in the importance of understanding reality over ideology, of recognizing the enemy accurately, and of preparing for the full consequences of misjudgment. Ultimately, the story of the final phase of the Pacific War was not merely about battles or weapons, but about the intersection of perception and reality. Yamamoto's insights had anticipated the trajectory of conflict with remarkable accuracy. The Americans were not soft, they were not divided, and they were not vulnerable to quick strikes or intimidation. They possessed the resilience, resources, and resolve to see a war through to victory. Japan's failure to recognize these truths resulted in a catastrophe that reshaped the world, and Yamamoto's legacy became a testament to the dangers of underestimating an opponent, ignoring expert advice, and allowing ideology to dictate strategic judgment. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation on the brink of collapse. Its cities lay in ruins, its industrial base was shattered, and its military, once feared across the Pacific, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The American island-hopping campaign had brought the front lines ever closer to the Japanese homeland, and the lessons Yamamoto had tried to impart years earlier were now undeniable. The war was no longer a contest of bravery or tactical skill, it was a test of endurance, resources, and the ability to sustain a nation under relentless pressure. Japan was losing on every front it had once thought secure. The Battle of Okinawa, which began in April 1945, had been a harrowing demonstration of American power. Japanese defenders, deeply entrenched in caves and mountains, fought with near-suicidal determination, launching banzai charges and ambushes that inflicted massive casualties. Yet, no matter how cleverly they fought, American forces advanced steadily. Each Japanese counterattack was met with overwhelming firepower, artillery barrages, naval bombardments, and waves of aircraft. The Americans had anticipated and adapted to Japanese tactics, turning desperation into predictable outcomes. Yamamoto had long warned that Japan could not match the industrial and logistical might of the United States, and Okinawa was the final, brutal confirmation. Meanwhile, the American strategic bombing campaign was reaching unprecedented levels of destruction. Cities across Japan, including Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, were being reduced to ash by relentless firebombing raids. In Tokyo alone, the firebombing of March 9 and 10 had killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a single night. Entire neighborhoods, built of wood and paper, were consumed in conflagrations that spread faster than any human could escape. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese citizens realized that the war had come home, and no island fortress or defensive tactic could stop the devastation. The gap between American and Japanese industrial capacity, which Yamamoto had foreseen decades earlier, was now painfully clear in both the skies above and the streets below. As civilian suffering escalated, the military faced its own insurmountable challenges. Fuel shortages, food scarcity, and the loss of experienced pilots and soldiers left Japanese forces increasingly ineffective. The aircraft Yamamoto had once considered the backbone of Japan's naval power had been decimated at Midway, and replacements could not match the skill or quantity of American aviators. Ships sank faster than they could be built, and new troops were poorly trained and under-equipped. By the summer of 1945, Japan was fighting a war it could not win, with no realistic path to reversal. Then came the culmination of American industrial and technological power, the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima became the target of the world's first nuclear attack. A single B-29 superfortress, Enola Gay, dropped the atomic bomb Little Boy, obliterating the city and killing tens of thousands instantly. The magnitude of destruction was incomprehensible. Buildings vaporized, fires erupted across the landscape, and radiation would cause long-term suffering for survivors. Just 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, ensuring that the Japanese leadership could no longer ignore the impossibility of continuing the war. The devastation was both material and psychological, demonstrating the unmatched industrial, technological, and scientific might that Yamamoto had recognized decades earlier. Within days, Japan faced a stark choice: continue a futile fight and risk complete annihilation, or surrender unconditionally. The Emperor, Hirohito, addressed the nation on August 15, 1945. In a voice carried over radio waves, he cited the use of a new, most cruel bomb as the reason for surrender, acknowledging the futility of further resistance. Across the islands, soldiers laid down their arms, and civilians began the grim task of survival amid the ruins of cities, infrastructure, and society. For Japan, the surrender was both a relief and a profound humiliation. For Americans, it marked the successful conclusion of a long, costly, and bitter conflict that had tested the limits of national mobilization and industrial might. Yamamoto, who had died 3 years earlier, had foreseen the inevitability of this outcome. His warnings about underestimating American industrial capacity, ignoring the determination of the population, and over-relying on the notion of spiritual superiority had proven tragically correct. Yet his life had ended before he could witness the full consequences of Japan's miscalculations. The strategy, courage, and ingenuity that had characterized Japanese efforts were insufficient against an adversary whose strengths had been consistently misjudged. Japan's defeat was a testament not to the inadequacy of its soldiers but to the catastrophic errors in perception by its leaders. The post-war period was a time of reflection, study, and reckoning. Japanese historians revisited pre-war assessments and realized that the assumptions about America had been deeply flawed. Leaders had imagined an enemy that was divided, soft, and unwilling to endure casualties, rather than a society capable of extraordinary mobilization, technological innovation, and disciplined coordination. Yamamoto's voice, once ignored, became a symbol of what could have been avoided had his insights been heeded. Japan's defeat highlighted the dangers of ideological rigidity, overconfidence, and the dismissal of empirical evidence. Across the Pacific, the Americans also reflected on the lessons of the war. The destruction wrought by industrial mobilization, strategic intelligence, and technological superiority demonstrated the decisive importance of preparation and adaptability. The operations that culminated in the atomic bombings and the final surrender were the result of years of planning, intelligence gathering, and relentless production. The contrast between the Japanese approach, which relied heavily on tradition, honor, and assumptions about the enemy, and the American method, which leveraged analysis, logistics, and mass production, could not have been clearer. Ultimately, the final stage of the Pacific War illustrated a timeless truth: wars are won not merely by bravery or conviction but by understanding the realities of power, capability, and human will. The Americans, whom Japanese leaders had dismissed, had proven their resilience, resourcefulness, and determination. Their industrial, technological, and organizational capacity had turned apparent weaknesses, democracy, individualism, and material abundance, into decisive strengths. Yamamoto had recognized these factors long before the war began. Though he could not prevent the catastrophe, his insights offer enduring lessons on perception, strategy, and the dangers of underestimating an opponent. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, closed a chapter of history marked by extraordinary courage, catastrophic miscalculations, and the profound consequences of misunderstanding an enemy. The story of the war's final stages, from the ashes of Okinawa to the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, underscores the enduring relevance of Yamamoto's warnings. He had foreseen that the war would not be decided by a single battle or heroic charge, but by the ability of a nation to sustain itself in a conflict of attrition. In the end, his predictions had come true, and the consequences were written in the ruins of Japan and the victory of the United States. Japan did not lose the war because its soldiers lacked courage. It lost because it misunderstood its enemy. And the one man who knew the truth was ignored.